Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. As you guys know, we're in the coronavirus shutdown, so I'm having to do all these videos online, which is the reason for the existence of my YouTube page. If you're watching this video, then you're either enrolled in my Human Anatomy and Physiology class, or you stumbled across these videos on the intra-Google looking stuff up, okay? So if you're in my class, these videos are intended for you. If you're not in my class, these videos are intended for students enrolled in my course. So the breadth and depth and how I cover the materials for my classes, if you find it helpful in other instructors' classes, by all means watch it, but this may not be everything that your instructor covers. Got it? My disclaimer. Now, we've been doing a series of endocrine videos. This video, I think, is video number 6 in the endocrine series. We have gone over adrenaline, the direct neural stimulation of the adrenal medulla to release adrenaline for prolonged stress. You should know that, and you should know all the effects of adrenaline, fight or flight. We've covered that. We've covered the hormones of the posterior pituitary or neuroendocrine reflexes, which is oxytocin and ADH. And now we've been doing a series of hormones that are involved in the complex endocrine pathway going through the anterior pituitary. Okay? If you're following along in my note set, then we're going to be on page 28. We're going to cover one of these hormones of the complex endocrine pathway. It's the last hormone we have to do. It is called cortisone. It has a cousin named cortisol. They're very similar molecules and they have the same effect. Now, before I get into cortisone, there are some definitions on the top of page 28, and I need to explain these definitions. And I'm going to do so in a way that hopefully makes a lot of sense to you, so that when I throw these fancy words out, they're not just words that you're memorizing, but you understand them. So, fortunately, I have access to the school today, so I can use a bigger board. Still not as big. This thing is another 10 feet that way, but this is better than the little one in my dining room for those of you who've been following these videos. All right, so now, if I take a human being, here's someone's face. When we eat a meal, you take a big bite of something. Let's say you're going to eat carbohydrates. When you take that in, a couple of names for carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are also known as complex sugars, also known as polysaccharides. Poly means many, saccharide means sugar or some sweet or something in some language. Now, animals and plants store sugar. Plants convert carbon dioxide and water and the energy of sunlight to rearrange the chemical bonds to form glucose. If they make more glucose on a really sunny day with a lot of carbon dioxide and water around, then they make more than they need and they can store that glucose. And so animals store glucose as starch. Plants. And the starch would simply be a whole bunch of sugars stuck together in these chemical bonds. Every little S with a circle around it is going to be what we call a simple sugar, a monosaccharide, a single sugar. And I'm not going to draw an S everywhere, but if I started to do all these little lines into a three-dimensional shape, then everywhere where two lines intersect, there would be sugars there. Okay, I'll go ahead and fill it in just for now. Okay, so we would have all these sugars stuck together in large complex chemical bonds. Why are they important? Well, it turns out, I'm going to draw another thing over here for the time being. We need sugar. And the simple sugars that we use, there are 3 different simple sugars we can use for energy. The primary one we talk about is glucose. There's another one called fructose, and there's another one called galactose. All 3 of these sugars have the exact same chemical formula. There's 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. Which makes one different from the other is the arrangement of the carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. Okay, they're put together slightly differently. Ultimately, if I take all of these in the presence of oxygen and an organelle called mitochondria, then I'm going to get 36 molecules of ATP. I also am going to get some some carbon dioxide and some water out of it. And oddly enough, plants take the carbon dioxide and the water with the energy of sunlight to make the sugars, and then we or other animals eat those plants. Okay? Now, in plants, we would call a large chunk of sugar starch. In animals, The exact same thing would be called glycogen. Okay? So starch and glycogen are these large conglomerations of these simple sugars stuck together in a bunch of chemical bonds. When you take a bite of an apple or lettuce or tomato or a chunk of steak or something, the glycogen, or if you eat liver especially, glycogen or starch in plants is nothing more than a whole bunch of sugar. Now, in order for us to burn it to make energy in our cells, we have to digest this. So we are going to digest this using enzymes in our digestive tract. We break down these carbohydrates or complex sugars or polysaccharides into monosaccharides or simple sugars, and then we can burn them for energy. Now, if you get to eat more sugar than you need, if I don't need as much energy, I eat more sugar than the amount of energy I need to burn for a particular activity for a particular day. We don't pee out the excess sugar. We don't let it come out the other side either. We don't waste anything because, sadly enough, most humans and most animals on Earth don't know when their next dose of food or nutrition is coming from. So when we do get the chance to eat, Mother Nature conserves highly, and one of the things we do is we take any extra sugar and we convert it into glycogen. We simply stick, I'm drawing the G for glucose. I should have put an S for sugars because it could have been the other sugars. But if I take a whole bunch of glucose and stick it together in these large three-dimensional chunks, then what I have formed is glycogen. And we do this in our liver and in skeletal muscle. Our liver is a large glycogen reserve, but every skeletal muscle, since it's the muscles burning energy to keep us alive, to hunt for food, to forage for plants and things. Imagine if we were living in the jungles of Africa or South America, if we were living on the Kalahari or Bushman, or if you watch the TV show Naked and Afraid, which happens to be one of my favorite shows because it illustrates a lot of human physiology and how our bodies were designed, or evolved. But if we have extra sugar left over, we convert the simple sugar, we can make these chemical bonds with a bunch of enzyme reactions to turn it back into glycogen. And we store glycogen in our liver, we store a little bit in skeletal muscle. So that if we do have a fight or flight response and we need to run from a cheetah or something, we don't burn up all the sugar in our muscles before we digest it from the liver, put it in the bloodstream, and ship it to the muscles. So we always have a little bit of glycogen in each skeletal muscle. Now, here's the beauty of that. If I don't get to eat for a few hours or a few days, if you are lost in the jungle, you can't find any food, you can't forage, one of the things that we can do is we can convert this glycogen back into glucose. I can digest the glycogen. Now, the process of converting the extra sugar into glycogen is called glycogenesis. I don't know if that red marker is working very well, so let me rewrite that word, okay? This process of converting sugar into glycogen, converting simple sugars like glucose into glycogen, is called glycogenesis. Genesis means to make, and the glyco refers to the sugar. Now, let me grab another red marker. When I break down the glycogen to release the sugars, the simple sugars, for energy production, that process is called glycogenolysis or glycogenolysis, okay? So, the word is lysis. Lysis means to digest, like lysosomes. The O is of, it's the digestion of glycogen to release glucose molecules for energy production. So, glycogenesis is the conversion of glucose into glycogen. Glycogenolysis is the conversion of glycogen back into glucose for energy production. We need to free it up. Our liver and skeletal muscle are almost like a glucose bank or a sugar bank. When you got extra, you put it in there. When you don't have enough, you can go tap into it, and hopefully it doesn't run out. Now, if you watch shows like Naked and Afraid, you notice that people lose a lot of weight in their 21-day journey. Well, when you don't get to eat, your body will do this to use glycogen for energy production. When I run out of glycogen, if I haven't eaten in a few days and I've exhausted all of my reserves in my liver and my skeletal muscle, there's one backup system that works. In our body, we can take fat, adipose, or lipids, and if you look at the chemical formula of lipids, they're made out of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Most lipids are pretty big molecules. Let's say if I had an 18 carbon lipid with lots of hydrogen and oxygen on it, I could break it up and rearrange the bonds and convert some of those molecules into new glucose. So if I can take fat or adipose tissue and convert it into glucose, then we call this gluconeogenesis. Gluco for sugar, neo for new, and genesis means to make. It is the conversion or the making of sugar, new sugar molecules, from adipose tissue or fats. Well, there's one more that's involved, and I keep leaving my markers over here, so I apologize for walking up and back and forth on the camera. Protein, which is really made out of amino acids, and if I look at the structure of amino acids, they're all made out of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. There's 2 of the 20 amino acids have some sulfur. We're not going to worry about that. But all of our amino acids, all 20 have at their base some carbon, some hydrogen, some oxygen, and some nitrogen. Sometimes not enough, but if I start to digest these molecules and I get rid of the nitrogen off of them, I can convert these carbons and hydrogens and oxygens in some chemical reactions with some others left over from other chemical reactions by the process of gluconeogenesis into new glucose molecules. So we have 3 definitions at the top of page 28. Glycogenesis is the conversion of glucose into glycogen in our liver and skeletal muscle. And that's where we store the energy in case we run out. We can't eat. Glycogenolysis is the conversion of glycogen back into glucose to release the sugar molecules for energy production until we can find more food. We can survive another day and hunt for food or forage for food. If that goes on for a prolonged period and I start to run out of all of this, then my body will switch to burning fat and protein, fat and muscle. And we can convert lipids and amino acids into new glucose molecules. That's the neo, gluconeogenesis, the conversion of fat, lipids, and amino acids into glucose molecules, and then I can burn them for energy until I get another big meal, and then I can completely restore all of this when I eat a lot of fat, eat some protein, eat some sugar. My body can rebuild my muscle, restore the fat. Which, by the way, this is kind of the secret behind a lot of these fad diets like Atkins and South Beach and Paleo diet and the Greek diet or Mediterranean diet. All of these diets utilize the fact that if you quit eating all these complex carbohydrates and your body burns up what you got, it'll start burning fat. And then when you get down to the desired weight, then you reintroduce the healthy amounts and the healthier types of carbohydrates and you rebalance. The keto diet is an example of that. One of the problems is you can form ketone bodies in the breakdown of protein, and they can cause some kidney damage, so I don't recommend them unless they're done under the guidance of a physician, but this is the secret behind them. Now that we know these definitions, we can go into the last of the complex endocrine pathways called cortisone, or the glucocorticoids. So I hope you have all this information down. I'm going to erase it, and we're going to go to the next step, all right? I'm going to try to keep this video under 30 minutes. I forgot to set my timer, so I'm just guessing. Now, we've been covering the complex endocrine pathways, and as you guys should know, the complex endocrine pathways work this way. Okay? We have part of our brain up here called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is connected by a structure called the infundibulum to the pituitary. We have the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. As you guys know, there's a group of cells in the hypothalamus that will detect some kind of stimulus. When these cells detect a stimulus, they're going to release a hormone into the bloodstream. In the hypothalamus, there's a special collection of blood vessels that connect the hypothalamus through the infundibulum to the anterior pituitary, and we call that the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. I wrote that out in another video, you should know it. The hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system is simply the blood vessels that connect the hypothalamus to the hypophysis, or really the anterior pituitary. When that hormone, which by the way, we've stated before, is always called a something RH, something releasing hormone, that will travel to the anterior pituitary and stimulate another group of cells in the anterior pituitary to release a different hormone. We usually call this a tropic hormone or tropic hormone. Okay? From there, that hormone will enter our bloodstream and it's going to go to some other endocrine organ. As it travels through the bloodstream and pops out, it will bind to receptors in some target cells. And we'll call this an endocrine organ in many of our pathways, and we're going to learn which endocrine organs go with which hormones. We've been doing that. And in this particular pathway, there's one more step where this hormone from the endocrine organ will travel through the bloodstream. It's going to bind to some target cells. It's somewhere in the body. And by the way, I always draw the receptors as membrane receptors. I've mentioned this before, but sometimes they are intracellular. I'll teach you how to know that in another video. And then these cells, which are called the target organ or the target cells, will give us the desired response. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? In almost every pathway, they've been a negative feedback loop. So if something gets too high, the response is to lower it. The response is almost always the opposite of the stimulus. Now, some students prefer that we write this out this way. So we need to know what is the stimulus for this hormone. We need to know that the hypothalamus secretes. I'm going to abbreviate this hypothalamus. Okay? And it's going to secrete or release the anterior pituitary. I'm just going to put ant-pit because you've been following along, hopefully. It secretes or releases. And then we have another endocrine organ which is called the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex. It's going to release or secrete another hormone. That's going to be our endocrine organ here. Then we're going to have our target, and we're going to get our response. And for this hormone, I'm actually going to give you a mechanism. How do we accomplish the response? What physiology is occurring? Now, the hormone we're going to talk about is a class of hormones called the glucocorticoids. I'm going to use a different color. The oids always tell us it's a steroidal hormone. Steroids, like the sex steroids, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, almost always end in either oids or one. So the glucocorticoids are steroidal hormones. And when I say steroid, what it means is they are derived from lipids or cholesterol. And because they're derived from lipids or cholesterol, they dissolve right through a cell membrane and have intracellular receptors. That's kind of the big deal about the oids and the ons. Cortico means it's from the adrenal cortex. It's a corticosteroid. Corticosteroids are steroids from the adrenal cortex. And gluco tells you it's going to do sugar balance. Now, the two major glucocorticoids we could talk about, one is called cortisone, and the other one is called cortisol. Now, one of the things I want to take note here is that anytime I have oid or one in the name of the hormone, they're steroidal in nature, and they are lipid or cholesterol derivatives, and they go right through the cell membrane and have intracellular receptors. There are a couple exceptions to that rule. One exception is if the word in the name that ends in "one" is the word hormone, it doesn't count. I'll review that with you. But these are steroidal hormones, cortisone and cortisol, and they are part of a class of hormones called glucocorticoids. They come from the adrenal cortex. They do sugar metabolism. Well, what is the stimulus for the release of glucocorticoids? Well, we can say very low concentration of glucose in our blood. This is our blood glucose concentration. In case you haven't learned in chemistry, that bracket means the concentration of whatever's inside of it. So this is my shorthand for saying very low blood glucose concentration. What it means is you're starving. You have not eaten in a long time. I'm not talking about like you didn't eat breakfast this morning. I'm saying you haven't eaten since breakfast of last week or something. It's not that extreme, but after quite a few hours, 8 to 12 hours or longer, a couple of days, cortisone and cortisol are going to be released because your blood sugar is extremely low. There's one more stimulus that causes this, and that stimulus is prolonged stress. Stress or fight or flight means that you're going to be very active, you're going to be burning a lot of energy. And if you burn up all your energy, then we're going to have to go and restore that energy and raise our blood sugar levels back, which is the whole process of this hormone. So our hypothalamus is monitoring our blood glucose concentrations. If they get extremely low or stress lasts for too long, then the hypothalamus is going to release a hormone. And that hormone here, let me get my blue marker. I keep setting markers down over here, and I apologize for going back and forth. But the hormone that comes out of the hypothalamus is called CRH, which stands for corticotropic releasing hormone. And if you've been following my videos, if this is your first one, I'm sorry, you need to go back and watch some of the others. But my H and my R combined is my word for hormone. It's my shorthand for hormone, my own personal one. So corticotropic releasing hormone, that would be this, CRH, okay? So we can plug CRH in here. It goes to the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary is going to release a second hormone. That hormone is going to be called ACTH. You need to know the abbreviations. It's your responsibility to know the full name and the abbreviation. And that stands for tropic hormone. There's the A, there's the T, there's the C, and there's the T. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. And some people call this corticotropin. That's another name for it, corticotropin. But I call it ACTH. ACTH would be released at the anterior pituitary, and it's going to target the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex. And the cells of the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex will secrete cortisol and cortisone. One is an alcohol form, the other one's a ketone form, and it doesn't really matter. That's some chemistry that if you do organic and biochemistry later on in your career, you'll understand. But they're very closely related molecules. Cortisol and cortisone. Well, where do we store all the sugar? If our blood sugar is too low, where do we got to go to raise it? The target will be the liver, adipose tissue, and skeletal muscle. And the purpose the response is going to be to raise the concentration of glucose in your blood. It will elevate blood glucose concentrations. If the stimulus is blood glucose levels are too low, we're going to raise it. And that will provide sugar for energy for that stress until we can get to a quiet, calm place. The mechanism is going to be Glycogenolysis. So in liver and skeletal muscle, I'm going to abbreviate skeletal as an SK, but in the liver and skeletal muscle, we have glycogen stored. So we're going to go digest that glycogen and convert it back into glucose. And we can get gluconeogenesis at at skeletal muscle and adipose. We're going to convert fat and protein into sugar, raise our blood sugar levels till we can get out of that stressful environment, or until we can get another meal, and then we can rebalance our body back out. So that's the glucocorticoids, cortisone and cortisol, okay? And this would be the pathway. I highly recommend that y'all make this drawing and leave the names of the hormones and the organs out, and then you take the 8 hormones that we've been doing here. We've done, let's see, we started with thyroid hormones. You have TRH, TSH, T3, T4, targets and response. We did growth hormone, we did melanocyte stimulating hormone, prolactin, FSH, LH, the glucocorticoids, and I'm missing one. Anyway, I believe there's 7 of the hormones that follow this pathway. So you should know all of those hormones. You should be able to plug them into this picture or write this out and then write in all of the hormones, go through each one. Now, when our blood sugars rise back up, the whole system shuts itself off again, okay? I think that's all that I want to tell you about this hormone for now. Oh, I'll tell you one other detail. When we start to free up all these sugar molecules, you have to remember the biggest wimps or weenies in the human body are the brain and cardiac muscle. In order to preserve glucose for the brain and cardiac muscle, because they can't burn fat and protein, we can kick into, if we do enough of this for a prolonged period, we can actually go back into glycogenesis, and some of the sugar can be stored again. If we free up enough of it, we can keep cycling it in and out. I'm not going to go to that level of detail. This is what I want you to know for my test, for my class. What is the stimulus? What are all the hormones released from which organs? What are the target cells? What is the response? And what is the mechanism? And hopefully you understand what these words mean now, so you can picture it all in your head. All right? So we're done with the complex endocrine pathways. The next page in the note set is going to be insulin and glucagon. I'm going to do those next, and I wanted to do them right along with this, but I'm going to do them on another video where I start the simple endocrine pathways. All right? So I hope you had as much fun as I did. I hope that this was helpful. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.